I should tell you that doing the book of Job in about 3 sessions is seeing Europe in about a week. You just can't. I once taught a class on Genesis and human relations, and I could not get through it in a semester. And I mean, that was an actual class, in part because it's so rich. So for those of us who have not met, I'm Hemchand Gasai, and this is an area that is one that I have worked in, and it's one that over the years has been my primary teaching area at the university and college level. I don't get to do that much these days, as I do more administrative matters as a dean and deal with, you know how great faculty are. There are never a problem with them. But I want for us to talk a little bit about Job. And I sort of do a couple of introductory ideas. We will not be working through the book of Job line by line. That, by the way, it's not an impossible task, but that would be, under the circumstances, kind of a Herculean task. The book of Job is 42 chapters long. Okay? Now, you might say, but when I look at it, these chapters, some of them are very short, right? But as you will discover, right, we would be lucky to get through 4 chapters in the time at our disposal. Now, I mentioned there are 4 chapters because I'll be focusing on 4 chapters. Okay. Now, if you were asked to do this, you might choose 4 different chapters. But since I'm asked to do this, I get to choose the 4 chapters. We want to talk a little bit about, of course, Job and human suffering. But what we are also talking about, in my view, is about the idea of innocent suffering. And what does that mean for us? What does that mean as we look at the book of Job? And we will do some reading here. Now, this might seem, a little bit too sort of cerebral and academic, but I want to contextualize this for us. There is really no sort of across-the-board unanimity, or for that matter, even consensus about the book of Job and even the time of the book of Job. It could have been in the 9th century. It could have been, as many scholars who are much more qualified in these matters than I am have said. Some have said it's much later, perhaps in the 5th century. Okay? But when we read the book of Job, in my estimation, I'm not alone here, in my estimation, it's one of the most difficult books to read. Not only because of the subject matter, which we will deal with in a second, but because of the text. Okay? Now, what does that mean? Imagine, as one example, imagine reading anything, an article, an essay, a book, where words are used for the first time and never again. Now, so imagine, because the nature of our vocabulary is that it's so common, right, that even though we may use it, certain words differently, we have a vague sense of the meaning of the words. But imagine that there is a word that is being used where it's never used again. And you're trying to understand, how can I place this in a context? We have such words in Job. But even more difficult, in my view, is the fact that the book is made up of both prose and poetry. And of the 42 chapters, we have an opening section that I think we could call a prologue, and not surprisingly, the ending section, which we would call an epilogue. Okay? And those are the only two sections of prose. The whole middle, practically 40 chapters, are poetry. And you know, as I do, the translation of prose, while challenging, right? Because the moment we translate something, we interpret it. So for those of us here, we also know that even though you translate something literally, you are still interpreting that. It's just an interpretation. This morning we heard from Pastor Dave, I think in case you missed it, right? It would be about hearing. Okay? And by the way, if you're thinking, oh, did we speak about hearing? You obviously were not there. Okay? Okay. All right. It's about hearing. It's the second service. Then they'll hear it. Now, I happen to think that hearing is an auditory matter. We can all hear stuff. Listening is a whole different story. Okay? It's not just auditory. We can all hear. But to listen, there is something active about that. And in Hebrew, sometimes the word is translated both hear and listen. It's the same word, Shema. It's the famous sort of creedal statement in Judaism, as you well know, what is called a Shema, okay? And it's called a Shema not for any fantastical kind of theological reason. It's called a Shema, as you can guess, because it begins with the word Shema, okay? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. It's sort of the monotheistic statement, creedal statement, okay? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, okay? But you also have to listen. So sometimes as we hear these words and as we translate, we're also interpreting, okay, as we will discover. So we're going to look at a little bit of the poetry. But if we think that prose is a challenge to translate, you can imagine poetry, okay? Now, great translators over time have done remarkable work to bring to us translations of ancient and modern poetry. And I'm grateful for that. And I mean that sincerely, I am. It's not something that, one, I'm qualified to do, or frankly, more importantly, that really I want to spend my time doing. So we will look a little bit at the book of Job. We will look at some of the vocabulary and some of the syntax. But I want to begin by asking us, which is, and I will preface this by saying, this is an entirely unreasonable question, and I'm filled with unreasonable questions. If I were to say to you, who would you consider in our time, but even across the centuries, as the innocent, who would you say? Who are the innocent among us today and in times gone by? Children. So, okay, and then I will, as you can imagine, I believe that follow-up questions are always more interesting. So I'll get to my follow-up question in a second. Who else? No one? No one is innocent. Now, people who are cynical might say, well, Alan, how can you be so cynical? Well, we're not cynical people. We're not old enough to be cynical, by the way. No one is old enough to be cynical. So no one is innocent. So we have some interesting, we have no one, but we have some children. It's not a binary question. So there's all kinds of gray in between. But can we think of other innocent groups of people or individuals? By the way, are all children innocent? Not yours. Okay. I feel like I'm in the middle of a confessional here. Okay. Young children? Babies? Are all young babies, whoever they are? until they can say the word no. So newborn are innocent, but are they a little selfish as well? They're born into sin, original sin, which of course you can't get around it. But you're not going to find the word original sin in the text. I know you're thinking, okay, Hemchan, you're wrong on this one. No. That's a theological sort of construct that we've created, kind of like the Trinity, right? You're not going to find that word in the Bible, unless somebody has sort of created a new Bible recently and put those words in. It's implied. It's a construct, right? It's a construct. So we want to talk about the innocent, and in some respects, I have this Hebrew word up here, which we know, right? It's the word Sadiq, okay? And it is translated in a variety of ways. It's sometimes, believe it or not, translated in legal terms as innocent in that sense, right? A person who is not guilty. But quite often, it's also translated as someone who is righteous. Okay? It's actually one of the most common translations. Okay? It's sometimes translated as righteousness, depending on the form of that word. But also, believe it or not, it's sometimes translated as someone who is acquitted in a kind of a legal system. So it all depends on the context, right? So Job is, in some respects, a Sadiq. And we will look, I want to read the opening section of Job, the first 5 verses. And one of the things that we adults, all of us here, I'd like to think, not to be audacious, but I think over the years, perhaps we have read to our children, and maybe we have even read to our grandchildren. But Chad's children are not, they're not innocent, right? So they're not. And as you can imagine, all 4 of our children are absolutely innocent, right? The perfection of our children. But here is the thing, all right? We'll read these opening verses in a way, somewhere along the line, over time, we have stopped reading to each other. And there comes a point where we just decide that we're not going to read to our children anymore, or they're not interested. And most recently, the title of the book eludes me, but there is a volume that someone put together of a variety of pieces, about 1 page, occasionally a couple of pages long, that they said, these are pieces that we should always read to each other. So I'm going to read to you the opening 5 verses to begin with of Job. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And I want for us to listen carefully to the description here, because there's a quiz coming up here. By the way, it's the statement that would send most students, right, sort of screaming. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camel, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. So let me pause. If that is the only text that we have, and I said to you, based on the text alone, how would you describe Job? What would you say? He's a good man. Okay? So let me pursue this for a second. What makes him a good man? He's righteous, believes in God. So I'm going to ask the second follow-up question. What makes a person righteous? I know. Right? This is why, for example, most people that I know would not want to travel across Montana with Socrates, because you'd be asking these questions over and over and over and over and over until you want to stop the car and put him out. Okay? So how else would you describe? He is righteous because he does the right thing. How do we define the right thing? Oh. It's reasonable, right? He's thinking about his children. He's concerned about their welfare. He's concerned about their souls, right? Okay? Maybe he's an enabler. Okay? He started from, by the way, we were only in verse 5 of the 42 chapters. From fear and the love, yeah, that's right. How else would we describe Job just based on these words? He's wealthy materially. I mean, he has got a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff here, right? How else? At least on these verses, it seems like his focus is on himself and his family, right? All right. But we still have 42 chapters to go, right? Anything else? Now, there are some things that are mentioned here that should cause us to pause, right? The sons are having a party. Okay? They're inviting their sisters to be a part of the party. Okay? There are no in-laws involved here, so we don't know their status. But they're getting together, right? But we also don't know that they're doing anything that is, well, evil or bad. But there's something about Job who is saying, you know what? I'm not taking any chances here. What if in the midst of what they're doing, maybe they curse God? I mean, this is, by the way, this is a leap here. And I'm not taking any chances. Therefore, I'm going to send, and there's one, we have to interpret this because it doesn't say this in the text. He says, you notice what he says? And when the feast days were run their course, Job would send. It doesn't say send for them. It just, and actually there's not a Hebrew word in there. So the interpretation is that he would send for them and sanctify them. What does it mean to sanctify? I know we see these words and it's a common word, right? We know this word. And the word comes, of course, from the Latin, which we used to sing as part of the liturgy or chant. The Latin word, of course, is sanctus, right? That means holy, right? I want to send for them so that I can somehow sanctify them, make them holy again. And we are creating a scenario that says in all of their partying, in the event that they have done this, they might have done something that goes contrary to what it means to be, well, holy. Now we can get into the whole business of what it means to be holy and stuff. But Job is, he cares about his family, about his sons and daughters. He wants to be sure that their welfare, in many respects, is intact. And so he would send and he would sanctify them. Now, do you think that Job is a religious man? It's not a trick question. Do you think Job is a religious? Okay. Yeah. It doesn't say, but do you think, based on what we know about Job, the little we have read, the little we've heard, that he's a religious person? What do I mean by religious? Am I asking the question, or are you asking me the question? The fear of God. Okay. By the way, you notice these are words that we use regularly, right? Sanctification and sanctify. What does religious mean? A belief in God? Because the way we have come to think of fear, right? I'm going to drive the fear of God into you, kind of thing, right? This is not out of respect and regard here. Now, here's the thing about being religious. The word actually means to bind to something. That's the root of the word. The word means to bind to something. Whatever it is that you bind yourself to as maybe primary, maybe at the core, that's it. By the way, if it's power, if it's wealth, and we know, right? If that's what you worship. By the way, the word and its root, we know derivatives of it. We may not think we do, but we do. It's the same root that gives us something that everyone in this room has. I can say that, not to be audacious, but I can say that with absolute certainty. It's the same root that gives us the word ligament. Okay? It's what binds things together. We don't want that thing to be torn up. Okay? So whatever, Job is religious because he binds himself to all that he feels is righteous and what he feels is holy. Now, here is the thing, right? Is it a good thing to pray on behalf of your children? Yes. It's not a rhetorical, yes. But does that in and of itself sort of sanctify and save them? Okay, so we already have the kind of character of Job, if you will, that is a noble, decent, caring, loving father. Because he's concerned so deeply. We don't know the history here. Maybe there is a history here that leads him to say, you know what, I got to do something about these kids and their parties. We don't know that. And I'm not trying to hide this from you. We're never going to find that out. But he is not taking any chances with this. So this is what Job always did. Now, here is the thing. He is described as the greatest man, right? He had all of this stuff. And he's described as the greatest man. The opening verse, we could spend an entire session just on verse 1. Because in verse 1, Job is described as blameless and upright. And it begs the question, what does blameless and upright really mean? And these are the two words that are used, by the way, in the Hebrew text. Tam and Yashar. Okay? Now, you don't have to know this. But if we take these words totally out of context and we said we're going to do sort of a Hebrew 101 introduction, right? we would translate it as a person of integrity. By the way, that begs the question, where this is going, right? I could easily ask you, what does that even mean? And who are the people of integrity in our midst? I mean, outside of this group. And what does it mean? And by the way, just as an aside, for one to have integrity, the root word, not here, but integrity in the Hebrew has to do with the heart. Actually, that's the concept, has to do with the heart. So if we took this just as a person of integrity and innocent, and Yashar is that blameless and upright, that is blameless and honest and has ethical standards. And that's the translation of these words, kind of just outside of any context. I am not crazy about the idea of ethical standards, right? We all have ethical standards. The issue is not whether we have ethical standards. The issue is what? Whether we have moral grounding to abide by those ethical standards. That's the issue. The issue is not whether or not we have 55 miles an hour or 65 miles an hour. The issue is, do you drive 65 miles an hour? I mean, I know you do in this room here because, of course, you're law-abiding, ethical people. Okay. That's not a question. So, but that's this sort of clinical translation here. And this is who Job is. Now, I want for us to keep this in mind. Who is describing Job as blameless and upright? It's not a trick question. And by the way, when I hear silence, I think of when I used to teach, and my students used to take every question I ask as a rhetorical question. And this isn't. Who is the author? And of course, we don't know, because we know what I didn't say is that most scholars believe that the poetry section and the prose section come from two different sources. Okay, but so it's joined together just to actually create the kind of ethical questions that we human beings have. Is that what the text says at this moment? It's funny you would say that, because that is almost exactly how we treat the Bible in our society, right? We take a piece here that we really, really like, and then we take a piece here. I mean, we don't really want to take the piece that has to do with, women should not speak in church. I mean, that's okay. So let me answer it this way. And to be inspired is what? Literally, of course, it has to do with an infusion of the Spirit, right? Right? I mean, literally, that's what the word means. If you inspire, you're alive. If you're not alive, you have just what? Expired. You no longer have breath. Literally, okay? So here's the thing. How many, let me go, just a quick aside here. How many Gospels do we have in the Bible? Not a trick question, of course. We have 4, right? By the way, we know that there were more than 4, but only 4 made it into the canon. We know of at least 12. Okay? And if you've not had a chance to read the Gospel according to Judas, it's a treat. Okay? I'll put it this way. He does not come off looking badly at all. Okay? Do the 4 Gospels agree? We have 3. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, they're called synoptic because they see things alike as an optic. John, it's a whole different breed. Okay? There are gospels that do not have a birth narrative or a resurrection narrative. But these are inspired, right? But inspiration does not mean uniformity at all. So it's all how they see, for example. Mark is writing because one generation later, he's thinking, well, Jesus says, I'll return soon. But evidently soon did not quite happen in a week or two or a year or 10. So I better get some of this stuff written down. And last time we checked, we're still waiting. Okay. So yes, there's inspiration. But in this context here, blameless and upright is a description that is being used by the narrator, right? Right. All of the above. And in this case, blameless and upright is and he's the greatest man of the East, right? So maybe everybody works for Job. By the way, you know what we're doing here? We're extrapolating all kinds of ideas, some of which might have to do with the context in which we live right now. And there is somewhere along the line, we'd like to think there was some righteous guy. But again, do we have a historical character by the name of Job? It's possible. But even if you didn't, right, we have the story here. And within the story, we have these ideas that we have to deal with. And we can't simply say, well, that was a different time and in a different place. So the narrator says that you are blameless and upright, and we don't know what all lies behind that. Am I working for this guy? Am I his chief of staff? Right? But he is described as blameless and upright. Now, it's really important. This is not easy to read up here, but let's take a look. This is how we look at translations. And if you notice, the New Revised Standard Version says, sure, which is what we're using, that he's blameless and upright. But look what the King James Version says, that he is what? He is perfect and upright. We'll get back to the King James in a minute. Look what the Jerusalem Bible and the Jewish Publication Society says, he is sound and honest, right? By the way, we can deal with this for a long time. What does it even mean to be sound? You're of sound mind, right? That's sometimes how we use that phrase. The Message, which, by the way, parades as a translation, it isn't. It's really a paraphrase, right? That says, he is honest inside and out. And that bears no resemblance to the Hebrew. Let me be very clear, right? And simply because something is easy to read does not make it legitimate. So you can draw your own conclusions there. And then the Living Bible simply says, he's a good man. Okay? So depending what you're reading, this is what we end up with. Now, take the King James for a second. I would like you to help me out here. Define perfect for me. No frauds? No flaws. So give me an example of the perfect person with no flaws. Outside of yourself. Jesus. No flaws. By the way, Jesus did one. Remember the miracle with the blind man in the Gospel of Mark who came with a sight? And Jesus did some mixing with mud. Remember that? With saliva and put it on his eyes. And it fell off. And essentially Jesus says, what can you see? And the guy says, well, actually, everyone looked like trees. Which, by the way, generally would not be a good thing. And what does Jesus do? Essentially, he did it again, right? It's kind of like plan A didn't work, right? I mean, if you want to see, I should be able to see Pastor Ted Snyder as Pastor Ted Snyder. I should not be looking at you and says, yeah, it's working, but you look like a tree. No, that doesn't work. But by the way, it's in the text. I know you're thinking, does that really happen? Yeah, it is. It really did happen. But here is the thing, all right? So we have to be attentive. I mean, can imperfect human beings capture perfection? How do we do that? Yeah, go ahead. Which immediately brings us to a pause, right? And we don't want to get overly philosophical here. But the moment we believe that we can define perfection in a way, it becomes imperfect. Because you cannot take that which is infinite and put it in the finite. I mean, the moment we do that, and that's why I'll speak for myself. I become not nervous, but I'm very suspicious of folks who have figured out God entirely. And we have that, right? We have that. And it's generally for sale on TV and elsewhere. Folks who have figured this out. If you do that, right, you have somehow reduced the divine to something that is imperfect. Because we human beings are not perfect, which is to say that we cannot capture. We will discover that as good a man as Job is, that's a terrible translation. He's not perfect. We know he's not perfect. To say that he's perfect and upright, I think misses the boat. Now, so here we move on to verses 6 through 12. I want to remind you that when we started, I said, we may not get through the, okay, so life becomes more complicated here too. So here we go. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord. And the accuser also came among them. The Lord said to the accuser, where have you come from? The accuser answered the Lord, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. The Lord said to the accuser, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Then the accuser answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to the accuser, very well. All that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him. So the accuser went out from the presence of the Lord. We're up to verse 12. What's the difference between blameless and upright in verse 1 and blameless and upright in verse 8? Same words, different context. Is there a difference? When the narrator says that you are blameless and upright, that's a good thing, but it could very well be because, right, I mean, maybe I work for you, you're wealthy, you're the greatest man in the East, right? I don't want to cross you. We don't know. But what's the difference in verse 8? This is the Lord saying that you're blameless and upright, and that changes the whole scenario all of a sudden. Yes. We'll get to that in a second. Okay? It's not someone you want to mess with. But I will tell you in a second. Blameless and upright. It's one thing for me to say, as much as you would want your spouse or your children or your siblings or your parents to say, here is X, who is blameless and upright. You might say, well, of course they're going to say that, right? They're my parents. They're my kids. But when God says you're blameless and upright, it should give you pause and take note. Same words. And God, in this case, just to be clear, if you look at the text, you will notice all of those uppercase letters for Lord. That's not by accident. There are different words in the Hebrew Bible for Lord. And when we translate it, at least in the New Revised Standard Version with all uppercase, it refers to Yahweh. Okay? There are other lords around. Okay? With lowercase, Adonai, the word that is very common in Hebrew, right? Simply means Lord. You could be Lord, and be Adonai. I mean, we think of it as only about God, but actually it could be any Lord. But this is Yahweh. And Yahweh is saying, have you seen? Now, second question for you. Who broaches the subject of Job in this story? It's God. It's the Lord. And is God proud of Job? Yes. Have you seen my servant Ted? And Ted is saying, leave me out of this. Okay. Have you seen my servant Job? I am so proud of my servant Job. He's a blameless and upright man. So, to the question, who is the accuser? Okay. Who is the accuser? I'll come back to this in a second. Now, this is going to be disappointing for you. It doesn't say devil. I know. So what do we do with this? The Hebrew says Satan, which of course we know more as Satan. Okay? But let me pause and I'll back up a little bit. By the way, this is a fairly common word. It's Hebrew, but for those of you who might know a little bit of other, even Asian languages like shaitan, okay, guess what? Same word. And it's often translated evil. Okay? Well, here is the thing. There are two ways to think about this. Let me step away from the Bible for a second. And let me put it more historically so that we don't get political here. The first president of the United States was George Washington. His first name is George. It's not a trick question. George. I know the question is so simple that you must be thinking. I think it's George. Okay? George is his name. Right? What's his title? The president, or previously, general, right? The title and the name may refer to the same person, but they're not identical. Okay? Elizabeth is the queen. The queen is not her name. It's the title. Now, why is this important? Because the word in Hebrew, I know this is, bear with me here for a second. Okay? The definite article in Hebrew is pronounced ha, the definite article. If you see ha in front of a word, 99.9% of the time in translation it will be the. Okay? We know this in English, right? The definite article. Okay. This word is used both ways in the Hebrew Bible. It's used with the definite article and without the definite article. So on the one hand, it is sometimes a name, and on the other hand, it is sometimes a title. And we see it both. So it's not as if this is not just like a grammar issue. We see it both ways. In this case, it's a title. And the word Satan in Hebrew means the accuser. Occasionally, it's also translated, depending which translation and this is not a bad translation, it's a good translation, the adversary. Okay? The adversary or the accuser. Now, let me back up a little bit. Here is not the person, right? Here, I'll back up here a little bit here. Here is a title. This, and where is the accuser coming from? Where is the accuser coming from in this text? One of the heavenly beings. By the way, I'm going to complicate your life here a little bit before we meet next Sunday again. So you'll have a week to unravel this. Who do you think the heavenly beings are? I'm not making up this text. This is what the text says. Who are the heavenly beings? Look at the translations. The New Revised Standard Version says heavenly beings, we just read. Look what the New English and King James Version says. The sons of God. So I'm going to give you a multiple choice question here. Which do you prefer to talk about? The heavenly beings? Is that clearer than the sons of God? Is it? So is it the angels and the seraphs and the archangels? Except for one slight problem. It doesn't say any of that. Oh, you said that. And that's what I like. I love the confidence that says, I know what the text says, but let me tell you what I think it says. I am going to tell you what I think the text should say. Angels. And by the way, seraphs is our anglicized word. Of course, the plural of seraph is seraphim. Okay? And we don't add an S to seraphim. That doesn't exist. The im is already plural. Okay. Now, so here's the thing. And by the way, it says angel. So you're in good company. The New International Version says angel. And I hate to break the news. They were wrong. Actually, the Hebrew says sons of God. And no translation knows what in the world to do with that. That's literally what it says. The sons of God came. It says sons of God, right? Who are these people? You want me to say sons and daughters of God? You already have angels and seraphim. No. No, in fact, it's very inclusive in fairness, right? But you know, this complicates our lives, doesn't it? Because, I mean, whatever we say about this, it's going to have to be an interpretation. We actually have a different word for angels. We have a different word for, you know, a variety of things that we sometimes assume. This is not an indictment of us. We are left with statements that we cannot quite fathom. So we have to extrapolate. We have to interpret. We don't have a choice. And these are not God. Okay. So we have a dialogue going here, right? And to create this story, we have, quote, the sons of God. What you're saying here, Jeff, is not incorrect. It's a dialogue. But, you know, we are still stuck with this, who are the sons of God here? And it's used elsewhere, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible. This is not the only time. So we are left to wonder who are the sons of God. But for argument's sake here, right, let's go with heavenly beings, which is not clarified, but let's go with heavenly beings, which would say that these are the beings who are dwelling in the Hashemayim, as they call it, into the skies, into the heavens. It's the same word. And they come down, and lo and behold, we have the Ha-Satan among them. Who is the accuser? Who is the adversary? And every time I think about this, we have, you know, in the English political system, in Parliament, you have what? You obviously have Her Majesty's Party, right? Or His Majesty's Party. And the other side is called what? Not just opposition, but the loyal opposition, right? I sometimes think of Hasatan as the loyal opposition here. Who is going to be? But who raises the question about Job? It's God. It's God. And, you know, the accuser here is saying, I mean, this is where, think of the implications here. The accuser is saying what? You know what? All of us here who think we are wealthy and that we're good and we are blameless and we are upright and we are noble and we are virtuous and we do all of these things and we are settled. You know why? And because we are religious and we have bound ourselves to God, you know why? It's very cynical, isn't it? The accuser says what? Yeah, it's because God is protecting you. But let me tell you something, the accuser says. You take away all of that stuff, and what will Job do? What will we do? We will curse God. In other words, the accuser is saying, the reason we are who we are and do what we do and bind ourselves to whom, right, is because God is protecting us. But take it away. Become impoverished. Take away your wealth. Take away your everything. And you will curse God. It says, you will curse God to your face. And what does God say? You're on. You're on. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Job has no idea. So we have a wager going on, if you will, between God and the accuser. By the way, forget about the other heavenly beings. We don't know anything about them anymore. It's only one who stands out here. Meanwhile, that's going on over here, and Job has absolutely no idea. And let me lead you into a secret here. he's never going to find out what happened. It doesn't, in all of the 42 chapters, he's not going to find out what happened. So let me finish up just with this, all right, for today. Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only you cannot stretch out your hand against it. Translation? Okay, he's all yours, but do not touch him. Do not touch him. He's all yours, but don't touch him. Not yet. When I was in high school, in the English system, we had a volume